society, which is the over incarceration of pretty much everybody, but especially Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and also the way that our carceral system has evolved to become sort of one of our de facto mental health quote unquote treatment facilities, and the ways in which it is failing not only the individuals that go to prison with mental illness but also the community in terms of public safety. So I'm going to give a presentation. I'm going to present some slides. These are slides. The data at this point is about 4 years old, so it's getting a little bit stale. We're probably ready to update some of this, but this should give you a pretty good idea and a pretty good snapshot of how this has happened, how we got here, and ways in which we're trying to fix things piece by piece. One of the things that's really encouraging about the work that I do is that I am able to really help people. Hold on just a second. Slideshow, play from start. Okay, there we go. One of the great things about what I do is that I get an opportunity to really do what I think is justice. To people who see very little of it. My work focuses almost exclusively on the poor, on people of color, on people with mental illness, on the non English speaking among us. That is really kind of the focus of my work. And I've consider myself very lucky to be able to do that every day. Um, we've worked through my project. We've worked on a number of really successful criminal legal reforms that have made a real difference in the lives of thousands of people. But what we have found across the board is that the one group that doesn't actually seem to be benefiting as much as the others from these reforms are those with mental health disorders and mental health issues. And that's something that we're just continually trying to find ways to address as we move forward. So I'm going to give you sort of a quick overview because I know you guys have talked a lot about sort of the history of the carceral state in America and its impact on different groups. But just so that we're all on the same page, I'll give you a quick overview of how we got here, talk a little bit about where exactly we are and about how the mental health system works in prison and for my clients, and then talk a little bit about what it's like doing that kind of representation, how our clients end up faring in the community if we're successful in getting them released, as well as other measures that we would recommend moving forward that might have a positive impact on this frequently overlooked group. So the first thing we'll do is go to the first slide. Okay. So I know you guys have talked a lot about the rapid increase in the rate of incarceration in the country, and this I think slide is really really useful in looking at it, and in particular thinking about the ways in which mental health quote unquote treatment was sort of shunted away from state hospitals and to basic prisons. So you'll see that in the 50s, we began defunding state mental health hospitals. And you may have talked a little bit about this in classes prior, but the whole impetus behind this movement was really that state hospitals were not great treatment centers and that people were being sent there for strange reasons that didn't necessarily pan out in terms of actual mental health, and that they were basically warehousing the mentally ill in these big cold and untherapeutic environments. The idea was that it would be much more healthy for those that are suffering from mental illness to find their treatment in the community. There's a lot of data out there that shows that individuals tend to be more successful if they're able to partake in interventions within the community in which they live, in the community in which they have resources, family, familiarity. All of those things can really help when we're trying to stabilize somebody who is experiencing a mental health crisis. So you'll see they started defunding these big state hospitals in the 50s. And in 1968, the Lanterman-Petrus Short Act went further by imposing restrictions on involuntarily committing individuals to the hospital if they're experiencing a mental health crisis. So these two pieces of legislation were really aimed at protecting those who are suffering from mental health issues and who may need interventions either short or long term. That was certainly the philosophy behind the movement. Um, so in California in particular, these things happened and people were taken out of statewide supervision, returned to their counties. The idea was that the savings that we would have as a result of shutting down these big state hospitals could then be transferred to the various counties who would then use those funds to provide mental health support to those in their communities. Um, what happened instead, however, was that they shut down all the hospitals and they didn't do anything with those savings to actually support people with mental health issues. Then Governor Reagan vetoed funding for community mental health treatment. So you now had no state hospitals, you had no funding for community support. And right around that time, you'll also see in the 80s and through the aughts and the 2010s, uh, the California rate of incarceration skyrocketed. There are a number of reasons for that. As you can imagine, this graph sort of peak coincides with some of the war on drugs that we were doing. And I'm sure as students, you also recognize the sometimes intimate connection between self-medication with substance use and mental health disorders, and that can sometimes be an issue. And you'll see that both of those things, both the closing of mental health treatment centers and the defunding of community mental health facilities, coupled with war on drugs, were huge drivers of this massive, massive spike in incarceration in California. And when I first started this work, it cost $50,000 a year per inmate to keep someone incarcerated. $50,000 per year. That's now well over 60 and beyond. And also, the population in our prisons is growing ever older. There are a number of individuals that are in prison right now that are in their 80s that are serving life sentences for minor level drug offenses. So that's just one example. Both the physical health deteriorates as individuals get older, and prisons themselves are terrible places for treating someone with a mental health issue. They are loud, they're scary, they're cold, they're dark. They use punitive measures to try to make people conform behaviorally. All of these things are a perfect storm for decompensation, and many individuals who may have had a relatively minor mental health concern prior to incarceration suddenly find themselves in a situation where any mental health issue they may have had before is now exacerbated because of the incredible difficulties and challenges and scariness of the prison system into which they're being placed. Um, you'll see here too that I believe you guys, in fact, I know you've talked about the Coleman and Plata lawsuits that were meant to attack the carceral state in California because it was so overcrowded that people were not getting sufficient medical, physical, medical, and mental health care in those prisons. And after years and years of litigation, finally in 2009, there was a finding that the California prisons were constitutionally overcrowded. And because of those conditions, they were completely unable to provide even basic, competent mental and medical health care. So that was around the time that I was in law school in 2009. And I remember being very excited to hear about the Plata decision and the Coleman decision being upheld, and the placement of CDCR in a receivership, meaning that they are now subject to continual monitoring by a special master to ensure that they are providing, and if not currently providing, or at least working toward providing sufficient medical, physical, mental health care to inmates. Um, so the Coleman litigation, we can just talk very quickly about. I'm sure you guys have talked about this already, but for Coleman, it was a class action that started in 1991. And one thing I think is interesting is that that was Pete Wilson was the governor at the time, and that's why it was against him. But I believe that in some cases, some of this litigation has gone through multiple governors, just trying to get CDCR to institutionally mandate appropriate and sufficient care for its charges. Coleman specifically was initiated due to an individual or individuals with serious mental health disorders. So the whole litigation strategy, which resulted in system-wide mandate to reduce the prison population, that was all initiated because of an individual or individuals that were not getting sufficient mental health treatment. So the reason for so many of these decarceral reforms, either through litigation, through ballot initiatives, or through CDCR's own mandates, a lot of the measures that were taken to reduce the population actually didn't help any of those who were suffering from serious mental disorders. What we have found over the years, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, is that many, many, many of those with mental health concerns are being left behind in the wake of these initiatives, and watching thousands of their compatriots, their fellow inmates, being released while they are stuck in these terrible conditions that, despite being less crowded, are still found to be insufficient to suitably treat an individual with a mental health crisis. So there are three types of care basically as part of the mental health services delivery system in CDCR. So anybody that's receiving mental health treatment of any kind in CDCR is designated as a consumer of the mental health services delivery system, or MHSDS. And they're loosely divided into three categories: triple CMS, enhanced outpatient or EOP, and other sort of more acute, more sort of crisis driven mental health concerns, as well as the State Department of Mental Health, or the state hospitals for those that have been found incompetent to stand trial or have other serious mental health disorders. Um, Triple CMS is by far the most common, as you'll see in this slide. It's the Correctional Clinical Case Management Service, and it basically, well, we'll talk a little bit more about it, but it's the lowest level of mental health care that you can be on in prison. Enhanced outpatient patient, or EOP, is a more intensive level of care. Individuals that are EOP frequently have to go to regular psychiatric group therapy and other therapeutic interventions to the extent that they're excused from participating in other rehabilitative programs. So for a long time, we would find that individuals that were in the EOP program, or enhanced outpatient program, that were trying to be resentenced by a court didn't have many of the things that the court was looking for that would allow them to come out, and didn't have many things that, for example, a board of parole hearings might be looking for in order for someone to come out. If you're an individual in California State Prison and you want to come out, generally, one of the best ways to do that is to show a court or show the board of parole commissioners that you've been participating in rehabilitative programming. So you've been participating in things like Alcoholics and Narcotics Anonymous. You've been participating in educational advancement programming. You've been participating in vocational training. You've been participating in courses like anger management. You've been participating in anti-gang programming. Well, if you're in enhanced outpatient treatment level of care, you can't do those things because your day is filled with your psychiatric treatment programming. And for a long time, this really worked against many mentally ill individuals, because they just didn't have access to the very things that they needed in order to be found safe to be released. And it was in the past couple of years that CDCR finally formally recognized in its Department Operations Manual that you are, sorry, I got distracted, um, that participation in your therapeutic interventions could be uh, considered by commissioners or by a court as sufficient participation rehabilitative programming to increase their chances of having an opportunity at really getting released. So it's triple CMS, EOP, and then DSH. Um, as I said, triple CMS is the lowest level of mental health care treatment for things like, for example, schizophrenia, psychotic disorder, bipolar disorder, and major depressive disorder. Generally, what this involves are individuals that are on psychiatric meds and that they're stabilized while on those meds and behaving. Um, and it includes medication and individual and group therapy. It tends to be a pretty low level. And what I will tell you from experience is that frequently, individual therapy means that a um, staff psychologist walks down the tier. So they're set up like a lanai building, basically. So if you're looking at a front of cell units, there'll be like a little walkway that goes past all the little doors. And um, many frequently the only individual therapy an inmate will get is a therapist walking by the door and yelling and saying, "Hey, are you okay?" And it's, as you can imagine, not a really great way to feel safe talking about any psychological issues you may be having, to talk about any episodes you might be having that bear on your mental health, not only because there's absolutely no confidentiality, but also because prison itself is a dangerous place. And expressing any kind of a weakness, particularly in that manner, could put you at risk. So it's a very inefficacious way to provide mental health treatment, as you can imagine. EOP, as this is, as I was saying earlier, a higher level of care. Individuals in EOP are in segregated housing, so they tend to be grouped together. And this is for acute onset or significant decompensation, including delusional thinking and hallucinations, where they're having a global assessment score of less than 50. And as I mentioned earlier, they get at least 10 hours per week of structured therapeutic activities, which can sometimes mean that it's impossible for them to participate in other rehabilitative programming. Um, I have a number of EOP clients, and I will later on read you an interesting exchange between one of my EOP clients and a Board of Parole commissioner, and you'll see just how little um, respect, care, and regard there seems to be for individuals that are suffering with acute mental health disorders. Um, Almost worse are the clients of mine that are not designated enhanced outpatient because they're afraid of the stigma associated with a mental health disorder in prison. So they refuse to get those kinds of services. They refuse to get any sort of mental health treatment inside. And then if they are released, they're released to the community with, very little understanding of how to be in their communities, and with no history of mental health treatment, it also becomes difficult for them to get a community diagnosis and supportive services that they might need. So in addition to prison itself being a very scary place that I think many of us might experience mental health crises in, just because it's such a traumatizing place, um, the individuals that are there and that are receiving treatment are not receiving necessarily sufficient treatment, and many of them are just hiding in plain sight because they're afraid to have that kind of designation for fear that they could suffer some repercussions from other inmates. So the next level, mental health crisis bed. This is inpatient psychiatric care. So this would be for somebody maybe who is suicidal. I have a client who frequently hallucinates and tries to jump off of the second floor tier in a suicidal attempt. He's then taken down by corrections officers, and then he's charged with what's known as a rules violation report. It's essentially like a crime that you commit in prison. So he's then charged with the crime of resisting a correctional officer in the doing of his duty, and that means that they're then punished for that. So they get an hallucination, they try to commit suicide. During the process, they're jumped on by a corrections officer. They then get penalized for that event and sometimes put in solitary, which you can imagine is also not very good for somebody who's suffering from a decompensation event. Someone who's already perhaps a danger to themselves or others. Um, but sometimes too, they will be then put into this crisis bed with again a 10-day maximum stay. And it's really meant to stabilize an individual who's just kind of really suffering from an extreme form of mental crisis. So I think that's the next level. And then finally, there is acute care, which is even more structured and also is a longer stay. And this is sort of the last step before they may say, look, this person needs to go to the Department of State hospitals because we cannot provide them with the care that they need to stabilize them in the prison environment. Um, so this slide will show you since 2000 the incredible surge in the percentage of the prison population that was receiving mental health treatment between the year 2000 and 2016. You can see it's a pretty steady rise. Um, I just got updated data recently. um, I don't know how aware you may be of this, but due to COVID, CDCR has made a really strong effort to reduce its population further. The idea there is to free up enough space throughout the system that they can do more social distancing, that they can sequester people who may have been exposed, et cetera, et cetera. So the idea is to reduce the population globally throughout California in the hope that they can then shift inmates to different institutions and provide them with a safer um, group living situation. So when at the start of 2020, the prison population was around 120,000. So there were about 120,000 people in prison at the beginning of 2020. Many of them, a great many of them, were in prison for nonviolent offenses. And between, I guess, March of 2020 and today, CDCR has has reduced its prison population to about 94,000. So they've gone from 119,000 to about 94,000, about 25,000 decrease to kind of hopefully provide some safeguards to the spread of COVID. But uh, of that 94,000, about 30,000, almost 30,000 of that 94,000 are either in triple CMS, EOP, an intermediate care facility, or an acute crisis bed. So that's 30% of the population now is experiencing some sort of mental health intervention. And again, the acuity is rising. We've definitely seen and continue to see higher levels of need among the mentally ill population, among those receiving treatment in the mental health services delivery system. Um, CDCR continues to try to find ways to address the dire need for higher levels of mental health intervention within the prisons. It can be difficult. Some of the things that they suggest Contribute to that problem are that many of these prisons are located in cities and towns in California that aren't near anything, and it's very difficult to get um, competent, experienced mental health crisis practitioners to live near these prisons. There are a variety of possible reasons for the acuity rising. I think, however, a big part of that is just the drop in the population, period. And again, it just points to the fact that while it may have been a crisis in mental health treatment that initiated this first wave of carceral reform, the very people that sort of were responsible for the beginning of this first wave are the same people that aren't experiencing many of the benefits of the wave. So while there may be a light shining on the lack of good mental health care in prison and continued efforts to try to improve it slowly but surely, part of the problem is that it's not helping these individuals actually get out of prison. Um, and again, we have yet to come to the place where we are offloading some of the savings that we can realize through reducing the state prison population by putting that money back into community based mental health treatment centers. Not doing that yet. This is also, again, this data is from about 4 years ago, but I would venture to guess that it is about the same based on my experience with this population. Um, there are more people that need mental health treatment placements than get them. And this gap has continued to widen year after year for the past, what is that, 10 years. Um, Go to the next one. In 2018, the chief of CDCR Psychiatric Services also wrote a really scathing report where he came down really hard on CDCR administration and said not only was it failing to provide services to those that needed it, but it was actually underreporting the number of individuals that need mental health treatment and then not providing services even to that underreported number. Um, it's really sad considering the fact that, so much more can be done for both public safety and for the health and safety of these individuals if they are able to receive more individualized community-based treatment than this walk down the hall and ask if you're okay kind of psychiatric services that sadly happen not uncommonly in our institutions. You'll also see that mentally ill prisoners have longer average sentence lengths than prisoners without mental illness. And they also make up a greater percentage of the prison population serving life sentences. Another thing, just to point out, is that the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation um, has a risk assessment tool that it uses called the California Static Risk Assessment, or CSRA. This is it's an administered tool. So a corrections officer will administer this tool to an inmate that looks at 22 different criminogenic factors. It'll look at things like your childhood. It'll look at the first, the age you were when you committed your first crime. It'll look at whether you have an education. There are just 22 different factors that it looks at to come out with a number about whether you're low, moderate, or high risk to commit a new crime upon release from prison. One of the sort of little secrets about the CSRA is that age is a huge factor. So pretty much if you're over the age of 50, your California Static Risk Assessment score is likely to be low, just generally. And it's broken into these 5 different modules. There's low risk to commit any crime. There's moderate risk to commit any crime if you're released. There's high risk to commit a drug crime. high risk to commit a property crime, or high risk to commit a violent crime. So the CSRA is used by CDCR to kind of get a snapshot of somebody's risk of recidivism upon release. And what you'll find, and this continues to happen, is that those with mental health issues tend to, more than other inmates in the general population, present low risk of recidivism in the community. So not only are they staying in longer and sadly at risk of experiencing even more acute mental health disorder symptoms, but they're also of the lowest risk to actually release. Um, so it's a really, really sad situation. Um, just to give you an example of a couple of clients that I serve, that I've been doing this presentation for a couple of years, and these individuals are still in prison, um, which is really sad. I have a client, a transgender client named Alejandra. She has had a history of psychiatric intervention since she was a child, probably related to her transgender identity. Um, she has a classification score. So, a classification score is what is used to determine the level of security of your housing in prison. So, if you have a low classification score, that means you could be at a level 1 or a level 2 prison facility. Level 1s and level 2 prisons are pretty open. I've been to one prison that has a level 1 yard, and you basically walk in. It's like walking into a softball field. Like, there's just high gates and you just like walk in through the gate, and all the inmates are walking around and going to their jobs and doing stuff, and they're out on picnic tables and they're playing, you know, chess or whatever. Up to a level 4. Level 4 is the highest security, and that could be you're in a segregated housing unit, and or you are in a cell in which you have no ability to see. You're you're in like a 180, so the guard can see everything that you're doing. There's no corner you can hide around. There's no, you know, wastebasket you can duck under. You are just like, you are in an empty room and a guard sees your every move. So that's a level 4. A classification score, like I said, the lower it is, the lower your level of security. Um, the classification score can go from 0 to up to 1,000 or more, right? You can, every time you commit a rule violation or commit an in-prison crime, your classification score, your points go up, sort of like a speeding ticket, right? Your points go up. So we have a client, our transgender client, who will commit an in-prison offense just to keep her score up so that she can be in a secure location, single cell, and will avoid being preyed upon by other inmates. So she's somebody with a long-term history of mental illness. She's dealing with gender identity issues and trying to maintain her safety in this hyper masculine environment. She's resorted to spitting toward her therapist. So what she'll do is she'll just like spit toward her therapist, not on her, but toward her. That gives her assault on prison staff. And when she gets an assault on prison staff, that's a pretty big deal. Her classification score goes up. She gets to keep her single cell and she gets to be safe. Of course, being alone in your cell is not great for mental health. So it's just this unvirtuous circle of, you know, she's mentally ill. She goes to prison for shoplifting for 25 to life. She's so mentally ill that she tells the judge she wants 100 to life. Um, no one's doing anything for her in prison. And she's not been able to get relief through any of the reforms that we have been pushing forward, because she keeps trying to keep her score up so she can keep herself segregated from the other population and protect herself from sexual predation. So she's really in a terrible situation. She is somebody that should not be in prison. I don't know that she's ever committed a violent crime in her life. And the likelihood of her coming out after being our client for so far 5 years now just stays lower and lower and lower. Um, I have another client who is serving a life sentence for driving a car that he was driving, his co-defendant left the car, said he had to go to the bathroom. Instead, he went and tried to break into another car. He saw that someone was catching him, so he ran back to the car that my client was driving, and my client drove away. So that particular client is also serving a life sentence. He also has a long-term history of mental health disorder. He did spend some time in the state hospital a while back, and he's continually dealing with hallucinations and psychotic episodes. He believes that he's got a whole energy, like a whole sort of business model for renewable energy. But he also, I think, thinks that CDCR is taking energy from his body. I mean, the gentleman is clearly mentally ill, and he's in prison getting like no treatment, and he will probably die there unless we can find a way to get him out. One of the saddest things I think I've ever read was a transcript of his parole hearing, where he was treated so abominably. It's hard for me to even talk about it, and I may read some of that to you a little bit later. You'll also see here that despite all of these tools that we use to determine someone's recidivism potential, the CSRA appears not to perform so well with individuals with mental health issues. They tend to have higher recidivism rates in actuality based on the data that we have. Now, another thing to keep in mind when we look at this is, well, are they getting arrested for nuisance crimes? And is that why recidivism rate is higher? Because they're more apparent and easier to incarcerate. The net becomes wider. They're easier to spot by police. They people don't understand what's going on, and there's maybe a higher rate of fear. But for whatever reason, those with mental health issues, despite their low CSRA scores, end up coming back to prison more often. So we can talk a little bit about the difference between the cost it is to keep someone in prison on an annual basis versus the cost of community treatment. Not only is the cost much greater to keep somebody in prison, but it's also sorry, I totally lost my train of thought. Sorry, I'm looking for trying to check the time, you guys. And I'm like, oh, if I do this, okay, 5:11. Sorry. So, how do I do this? You guys know. Here. Wait. Anyway, it's a lot cheaper to treat somebody for a mental health issue in the community than it is to keep them in prison and to try to do it there. Prisons were not designed to provide mental health treatment. There's nothing about a prison that is warm and fuzzy. I saw that you guys are going to be talking a little bit about, I did it in Norway. So I actually did a trip to Norway and Finland last fall and got to see the environment there. And it was heartbreaking to see how different it is there from the way it is here. It was heartbreaking to see, people that were living in basically like a dorm where they had knives out to do cooking, where, the staff were available to be supportive, where people were sort of met where they were. We had one tour guide who was telling us, look, we try to meet inmates where they are. If some inmates need just to be able to wake up on time. So what we do is we help them do that. We help them learn how to wake up on time and to come to a class by 9:00 in the morning. Like that is all they can manage. And that is what we're doing. One of my favorite things that was said when I was on that trip was one of the corrections people said, the one thing we know is that 90% of these people or more, the one thing we know for sure, kind of like death and taxes, is that 90% of these people are going to come back into the community. What do we do while they're here to keep them from coming back here again and to keep them from victimizing the community? What do we do? Guess what? We treat them like human beings. We meet them where they are. We support them. We try to give them skills. We try to, teach them about being a good community member. We try to make them feel supported. We give them stepped levels of treatment. So we may start out in a more maximum security environment and we slowly let them earn more privileges. It's just a completely different way of looking at things. One thing that has been working well. Does anybody know? View slide. Can I just look without the drat? Okay, sorry guys. I should be better technologically than I am. But so here we are. What can we do? One of the things that has been incredibly successful, certainly in Santa Clara County, is mental health courts. There is a judge there, Santa Clara County Judge Manley, who is an incredible character. He's got like an eye patch and he's super, like, you go to his court and people get applause, when they succeed. It focuses on early intervention when somebody is acting out or seems to be having a crisis. In Judge Manley's court, you go there and there's a district attorney, there's a social worker, there is a reentry provider, there's a public defender, and it's an entire interdisciplinary team that is all working with the court to figure out the best intervention for this individual person. How can we make it easier for them to feel safe and to be stable in the community? It's incredibly inspiring to go to watch this court, and I encourage you, if you're ever interested, to go observe Judge Manley's court, because it's kind of something special. And it really brings humanity into what can be a very cold and rules-driven system. But so there are mental health courts here in California and throughout the country, and they tend to show real promise in terms of public safety, stability, and humane treatment of individuals that are going through crisis. We are also constantly looking for ways to work with the legislation to find opportunities for resolving some of these issues. We at one point had tried to get a bill through that would tie a reduction in referrals of the mentally ill to prison to additional funding for community mental health treatment. So the idea was, okay, Alameda County, if you can reduce the number of mentally ill individuals that you send to prison in 2020, then we will give you all the savings that we as a state made from not having those 20 people in our system. We'll give you half of that money to set up a community treatment plan for Alameda County for those individuals. Sadly, that did not go as far as we'd hoped, but we continue to plug forward trying to work on that. Another thing that we have been working on is finding ways to address the COVID situation. So it's been a huge issue in California, obviously, and I'm not sure how many of you are aware of what happened with San Quentin and the movement of a bunch of people from a prison in Southern California that had a lot of COVID cases. They decided to move a bunch of those individuals to San Quentin, which is a very old physical plant. It's almost impossible to do anything like distancing or take any kind of sanitary precautions. I mean, I've been to the showers in San Quentin, they're terrifying. But somehow they decided that that's what they were going to do, and it led to a huge outbreak in San Quentin. Our project has been working with district attorneys in 3 counties to try to accelerate the release of individuals that are either high risk medical because of age or underlying conditions, or that, maybe have less time to serve on their sentence and they'd be safer in the community. One of our big efforts is in reentry. We work a lot on the reentry piece because from our perspective, these reforms are going to be a lot more successful if we're able to make sure that when people come out, they are successful. So it's been an incredible challenge, finding places for individuals to stay that are safe and that can provide them with the support that they need to succeed on the outside. We've had a release of a number of our EOP and triple CMS clients, with varying degrees of success, but we have found for all of them supportive housing, access to mental health treatment, and other kinds of post-release services to kind of enhance their opportunity for success upon release. But it is very much a starfish situation or a snowflake situation. It takes a great deal of personal handling, for every single individual that's released to make sure that they're aligned with the right mental health services and aligned with supportive and safe places to live. Sadly, when they come out of prison and go to these COVID safe places, they get really mad at me and they're like, Susan, I can't go anywhere. I'm out of prison, but now I'm stuck in quarantine. And I'm like, I know, I wish it were better. I wish it were easier. And I wish it didn't take a pandemic for us to realize that we need to reduce our population even further. But hopefully they'll find some relief in the future. But anyway, so that's kind of the presentation. I can very quickly read to you a bit of a transcript from one of our clients who's EOP, and who went to the Board of Parole to see if they would release him. And this particular client is serving a life sentence for abetting a botched car robbery. And so he goes before the board and he says, I'm suitable. I believe I'm suitable for parole because I want to be of service to my community. I no longer use narcotics or drugs or smoke anything for the past 20 years. I've had daily contact with my psychological doctors and stuff like that. And the commissioner says, well, if you had the contact with your psychological doctors, why are you still violent? He says, I was on the wrong meds for a while. Commissioner, what's that got to do with being violent? Inmate, medication. Commissioner, what's that got to do with being violent? Inmate, it ate my pancreas up. It was burning. Commissioner, what does your pancreas got to do with violence? Inmate, it's a psychological medication, and it was, how would you say, what you call valproic acid. And Commissioner, say that again, sir. Inmate, valproic acid. And so then he says, well, did you read your psychological evaluation by Dr. A? The inmate says, I don't even know who Dr. A is. Commissioner, he interviewed you. It's a 15-page psychological evaluation. He interviewed you. So I don't know if that gives you just a taste of some of the confusion and stress that, for an already stressful event, which is, a hearing to determine whether you're able to be released, and you're mentally ill and you have some issues and you're immediately attacked for being violent when, all you're trying to do is make it through your day. So anyway, any questions?
So I just want to remind you all, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat if you'd like.
No chat, no questions. Zoom is hard.
I was wondering if you could provide us with resources. You had said that we could attend the mental health courts as students.
Yes.
Yes.
So I will, I'll look it up and I'll put it in the chat. It's in Santa Clara County, so it's in San Jose. So these are open to the public and you can just go to the courtroom on that day. And let me find out when it is. I may need to give it to Nemesia, to Professor Kelly. and have her send that along to you, because I'm not seeing it easily on Google right now, but I will get it so that you can go watch. 'Cause it's it's really instructive and inspiring and encouraging. And do I see a raised hand?
Yes, my name is Lonnie. I wanted to ask you a quick question in regards to the mental illness because I'm familiar with that. I have a very close friend of mine. Um, he's not violent, never was on drugs or anything like that, but it's something hereditary, just overcame. And I'm afraid what we're talking about now could happen to him just by, police harassing him. But what are they doing, or what are you guys doing to educate the police? Someone like the commissioner who didn't have an idea of what's going on because he's not a doctor, so he wouldn't understand, the answer or the question, the person who was on those psych meds, was giving him, because being on the wrong medication can trigger and cause things to happen, which the commissioner wasn't aware of. And a lot of these officers have gone out and killed mental, mentally ill, patients because they're not educated or aware of what the problem is. And these individuals, they end up in the institution like we're speaking now, for many a years because they don't know how to protect themselves. They don't know what to do. So I don't know, your organization or what is being focused on educating the police force, most importantly. Thank you.
So Lonnie, I agree 100%. I think that, the longer I do this work, the more I think that interventions in the policing arena are super important. I mean, just like I think education for prison staff is super important. We're not doing that. Norway, for example, you can actually get a bachelor's degree if you serve as a corrections officer. So you can go in and get an actual degree and then move on. Their one of the number one things they look for in corrections officers in Norway is empathy. That's considered an important skill. I think American culture maybe is not quite as attuned to that particular type of approach when it comes to the corrections environment and when it comes to policing. We tend to be more of a law and order. It just becomes a lot harder, I think, to it becomes a lot harder both to educate and to get buy-in for these kinds of issues. And I don't think it's impossible, but I do think it's something that needs to have a lot of push, a lot of will needs to go into that. I can't even begin to imagine what kinds of things we could do with regard to policing. I mean, there are so many issues related to policing in our country, related to the way we do it, related to it's just it's such a big problem, Lonnie, and I so appreciate that question. I will tell you, however, that I am sure that the commissioner understood that mental health medication can have an impact both on your psychological well-being and on your physical, and that that particular question was not asked in ignorance, but in that same sort of attitude that I, sort of decry, which is what's that got to do with it? What's that got to do with it? And I'm hopeful that a lot of this stuff, because we continue to put these reports out there, we continue to put this data out there, we continue to talk to people about it, we continue, there are lots of mental health advocates that are out there talking about it, there are mental health courts that are out there talking about it. And I think it's just a matter of turning over this old generation and moving into a less punitive and more empathic system. But I encourage you to, educate in your daily lives. And then that's what makes me so happy to see all of you here and taking this class, is just knowing that there are going to be so many of you out there that have had some interface with these issues, and that it's not an other problem, that you recognize that it's actually a big public health problem in many ways. So thank you.
I have a question. Thank you for your presentation. So with the mental health courts, you said scattered throughout California, I'm assuming there's probably not a great deal of them, but is it who decides which of those cases are in the mental health court versus just a regular judge?
So that's a good question. I'm going to guess that that decision is made in as many ways as there are courts, right? So every system is going to be a little different. Every court in California is kind of like its own little fiefdom. And it's really funny because you'll talk to a court in Solano and you'll say, oh, I need to do XYZ. They're like, well, you do it on this form. That's the way everybody does it. And then you'll go to a court in San Joaquin County and you'll say, well, here's a form. And they'll say, what form is that? Nobody uses that form. So every single court is different and every single court thinks that it does it the way it's supposed to be done. What I'm going to guess, though, is the most common is that the defense attorney and or the prosecution will see that a case may have a mental health component that might be better addressed if it were to take place in a mental health court, and that they work together to come up with that kind of a disposition. So it's usually when I've seen it happen, it's been because either the defense counsel will approach the prosecution and say, hey, this individual has a mental health crisis or has had a series of concerns or has a history of, would you consider binding this over to the mental health court instead of the regular court? And that, the prosecution may request some kind of something in return, like, well, okay, only if this individual promises to be on probation for 3 years, or only if, that there's some sort of a negotiation that goes into determining whether or not a case is done in mental health court. I'm sure there are probably also some disqualifiers. There may be some crimes that are not eligible to be adjudicated in mental health court. It may be that, you can't ever adjudicate a violent crime in mental health court. I mean, I'm guessing that every court has its own set of criteria and its own processes, but usually that's about the way it goes. There will be an identified issue and that they'll work together to try to figure out if they can do it in a different way from the normal court system.
Thank you. And just to follow up with what Lonnie was saying, his approach and ideas would really, it's like doing the work on the front end so that you have less work on your end. It's almost like we need to work you out of a job. And it's like there should be some type of legislation mandate for our police system of how to handle these cases when there's a mental health component, instead of like coming with guns blazing, but with social workers and mental health technicians to intervene in these situations that usually ends up with a fatality.
I agree so wholeheartedly. I mean, I think it's impossible to ignore what we've been watching now that everybody has a phone, what we've been watching over the past 5 to 10 years. It's impossible to ignore that. And I think you're 100% correct, both you and Lonnie, and I'm sure many of you have similar thoughts.
And I wanted to ask, are you familiar with the NIH collaboration with Catholic Charities? NIH, National Institute of Health, I think that's what they're called.
Yeah.
And they do the first aiders.
So I'm not familiar with that particular program. No, tell me about it.
Okay, so it's called First Aiders, and it is designed to train community members. It's like a 3-day intensive training, and it's to train community members or advocates for mental health, and they separate it by adults or children. So you can take the, either or course, but you don't take them together. They're separate and distinct. And it's designed to be first responders in the community to help diffuse mental health issues, patients with mental health. And I was just going to ask you if you were familiar with it, do you think it would be helpful if, how you have the sticker Crime Watch, you don't necessarily put it on that individual's home, but if the police responds to, say, a block and they see various stickers, on that block, would it at least help stop the intensity of coming with guns blazing, realizing there are advocates in the community that can help diffuse the problem. Because, and I apologize, when you first came on, I was struggling with my internet and got knocked off, so I didn't hear kind of some of the very beginning, but I did catch some of it where you said that really helps with intervention when they're stabilized in familiar, right, communities or areas where they live. So I'm just thinking, you know, how that would help or could help, because every little bit helps at this point. It's so disheartening to see time and time again, they just come in because a family member is forced to call, and instead of asking questions, they're shooting first and then asking questions later. But it just makes me think, is that something we really should be thinking about putting in there? If we could have Crime Watch, we could certainly have some sort of sticker that would help, you know, alert
think-
folks that we have folks in the community.
That's a great idea, LaDonna. So, no, that's a great idea. And I think, you know, that's exactly what we need. We need ideas like that. We need, you know, people to come forward and express a real concern and interest and desire in stopping this from happening. And, you know, having social workers and mental health technicians arrive, having community members, people who are familiar with the neighborhood, people who are familiar with the people that live there, you know, serve as interventionists, volunteer interventionists as needed, and making it known so that police have less of a incentive maybe to come in and impose law and order as opposed to de-escalating a situation. I think that's a great idea.
Right. And I was going to say, and the program is actually offered free. I
Oh,
think
wow.
depending on your income. So some of them may charge, but I think if you have, you know, other expenses, and especially maybe being students that are already overburdened with, the, you know, expenses, but majority of the courses are offered free.
Oh, that's great. And what is it called again, LaDonna?
It's
Can you tell
called
me?
First Aiders. I'll try and put the link on the thing, but it's offered through Catholic Charities, and I think it's the National Institute of Health Council or something like that. But I'll put the link in the message.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you. Any other questions or comments?
Any other questions?
You know
I
how you
just-
said,
Oh no, go ahead, Hannah. Sorry.
sorry, Professor Kelly. I'm doing a presentation on, I did it in Norway, and I was just wondering if, like, because we went there and everything, how do they address mental health issues with their inmates, you know, compared to here? I mean, I know you just presented on here, but what is it like?
No. That's a really great question. That's a really great question. And honestly, when I went, I don't know that I looked at it with that specific lens. I think it was more just a systemic overview. I don't know that I have a whole lot of information about what they do with mental health issues in Norway. I'm going to guess, however, because their prison population is so small, they must have a different sort of avenue for treating individuals with mental health issues that intersect with the criminal legal system. While I was there, I met and saw a number of inmates, you know, kind of doing their thing. And, you know, everybody looked pretty together and, you know, tracking and stuff. So I didn't see any sort of decompensation while I was there, and I didn't meet anybody that, you know, exhibited any obvious signs of mental health treatment needs. But I mean, what's that? Who knows, right? So
Yeah.
I don't, sadly, that's a long way of saying I don't know.
Well, in general, I feel like the mental health of their inmates is better, you know, overall, just because of, you know, better conditions and better treatment in general. But
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's right. And it really did kind of make my heart kind of like, I don't know what a good word for it is, but you know, when our tour guide was saying, look, you know, some guys just need help figuring out how to get up and get dressed and get to a place. And if that's where they are, that's what we help them with. I just thought that's, you know, so humane and so true. you know, some people just need that kind of help, and they're there to provide it. So I would imagine that the mental health treatment there is probably better.
Thanks.
That was a really good question, Hannah, and I kind of wanted to piggyback off of that, because I think what comes to mind is just other higher middle income countries, developed like the U.S. They have a different approach when it comes to health, mental health, and public health, and they don't really see those divisions, and there's a lot more support. There's less stigma attached. So I think in terms of being a driver of over incarceration, we're like here in the U.S. This is like something that we unfortunately excel in, and it's a really bad thing. But I feel like they just handle things differently, and there are lots of different safety nets, so you don't fall through the cracks. And it's not impossible. It's to catch everyone in the nets that are there to provide that support, especially at the community level. I think that's what we're lacking. I think in the intention of the Lantrum and Petrus Act was like, oh, let's shift the responsibility. We feel like the community is the best way to address mental health issues, and that's the data says that. We have the literature that says that, but of course none of that had any teeth to it because they stripped all the funding from it. It was just like completely irresponsible way to address it. And so I was just thinking, I had a question for you, Susan. What would be your approach or your, the best way to deal with this? Because obviously we're looking at this issue through litigation or legislation, policy, or, how do we what would be your, the best prescription that you would give to our community mental health, specialists, if they were given, a bigger, like a piece of the financial pie to be able to address the situation, to stop people from, we've had some success. Obviously, we've had some funding go into prevention, substance abuse disorder treatment from Prop 47. That goes pretty far, but you mentioned that some of the bills and the legislation that have been introduced, it has gone to a certain extent. But what would be your vision for like really kind of like, whittling away at this, taking a hammer and really getting to the core of this? What would be?
Wow. So that's that, it's interesting. As I do this more and more, I get more and more interested in, rather than large systemic change, more local small change. So for example, when I came back from Norway, I was super, super into this idea. We need to change our entire correctional officer system. We need to get them, into education. We need to get them trained. They need to be trained for a year before they can even interact with inmates. There needs to be sort of a top-down expression of the importance of this kind of way of being. And I think maybe at this point, and this could change, I reserve the right to change in my opinion, but I think having community resources that were easy and accessible in every neighborhood, right? Like if every neighborhood had a place for, whether it's actual treatment or referral to treatment, something that was there for everybody to be able to use, to build community, to build, your neighborhood, so that you kind of know who's in your community, that you're all in this together. You're all kind of working together to keep everybody in your community connected and safe. That tends to be more of where I'm leaning these days. It just seems like too big a lift to make, these big systemic changes and still provide the kind of individualized concern that I think is needed in a lot of these cases. I think a lot of these issues with police would not be as common if, you know, people in the neighborhood knew who was doing what, where, and with whom, and were able to say, oh, you're having that issue. Let's contact our neighborhood liaison who will get the right people involved, or, you know, I'm definitely feeling like it's more useful to have it be small and to have those small changes then be adopted by other places. And that's mostly because I think that institutionalization is kind of one of those things that comes with big systems. And no matter how hard we try, if we approach these things from an institutional perspective, we run the risk of warehousing again and again. So, you know, I'm tending more toward setting up more local, more much smaller sort of intervention sites throughout our communities. And that would also raise the awareness, I think, of mental health issues in our communities and help people know who, you know, their neighbors better. But
Thank you.
I'm sorry if I can just chime in for one quick second, and maybe you can work on this.
Lonnie's giving me all kinds of work. I love it.
You know, LaDonna made an exceptional point, you know, in regards to monitoring, being able to identify those in the community with mental health. And one thing they do when it comes to predators, right? Sexual predator, there's a list of all. You can go online, you can look, and you can find out who those individuals are in your community, right? And likewise, they can do the same here. You know, with this, I'm just a suggestion. They could do the exact same thing, right? And they will know, because please believe me, those police officers who know those predators and where they live, right? Because it's a list. They are aware of those individuals. Likewise, if you do the same thing with those mental health issues, those individuals who have mental health issues, right? You make a list, and you can do that all across the nation.
That, you know, would be great. But again, these things are only as good as the people that are doing them. And there is a legitimate concern, Lonnie, that people will then be singled out and punished for having that condition. And sadly, that's far too easy and far too, unfortunately, I think,
You think they
common.
will punish them? They would really go after them more so?
So I'm gonna say that the potential is just really there, and
Hmm,
and all kinds of
I can
decisions
see.
can be made that aren't going to be beneficial. It could
I
be,
see.
even if it's ignoring, right? Oh, it's just that crazy person down the street.
Mhm.
We don't need to go do that, right? Like there's just too much opportunity for a non-professional looking at that data to, you know, take action or inaction that ends up hurting rather than helping. But I do like the idea of people being informed and
I'm saying
knowing what
more
they're getting
so.
into.
I'm sorry. I'm that list. I'm saying more so for the police, not for the community. I'm sorry if you
Oh,
misunderstood
no, no, no,
that
no.
information. Yeah,
No, I mean for the
more for the
police.
police.
I
Yeah.
mean for the
Okay.
police.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
Because there is also HIPAA concerns, right? There's
Yeah.
concerns of confidentiality. When it comes to mental health, people are really very
Okay,
sensitive,
that makes
as they
sense.
should be, because it's their, you know, their health concern. So I know it's really a fine line. And I appreciate what you're saying, Lonnie. I was just thinking when I made that comment was just more so that it didn't like stigmatize any particular house. But if there was just a way, just like with Crime Watch, you don't necessarily know it's just that house. Only some Crime Watch blocks now have a sign up that's not even just a particular house, but it designates when you come on that block, there are community members that are watching. So yeah, but it definitely is a fine line because of all the various concerns.
And stigmas, absolutely.
Mhm.
But no, you both make really good points.
Agreed. And I kind of like, in terms of the community approach, it looks like the first aiders, that is what they are set up to do, is to empower communities to address, to really help each member, each family, with individuals, and individuals themselves who are experiencing mental disorders, suffering from mental health issues. And that's really, they have a nice model for that. And it, that could be something that could be done through, for each community itself. And it's something that the communities could decide that they wanted to really enact. It's like, hey, look, can we adopt this? That could come in the form of a ballot measure or a local measure for that community. And it's something that really brings attention to the issue, like Susan mentioned. It's like really kind of getting the information out there. And then, with that, it's like, okay, well, how much would it cost? Going into the planning details and getting everyone really on board. And then you would have more community participation in the whole, the whole planning. It may take a while to get there, but I like the, LaDonna's idea, the information she provided us. It sounds really great. And then, I guess I'm always thinking like big, huge sweeping changes. Let's like get this done and fix it at the larger level. As when we think as public health people, it's like, but you can't always deal with policy in that way. And so obviously we come back to our own community's health as well in public health all the time. And so it's really kind of using a public health approach to address this issue, and really kind of going beyond diversion programs, which I think are great. But I think there's so much more that's needed. As Lonnie has pointed out, if there's and Tina, is there something that we can stop the interaction between law enforcement and those who are presenting it with a mental health episode, and it stopping preventing fatalities and shootings in the first place would be, so if we actually did take this rather public health focused approach, I think that we're all talking about.
Totally. And I do see Sarah asked if I had seen any examples of providers and medical teams working effectively in prison to help people with severe mental illness. And I will say the answer is no, I haven't. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I just personally haven't seen it. I do know that there are many dedicated and incredibly caring mental health providers in prison. I mean, I have met some amazing advocates and, counselors and mental health counselors that work with clients in prison. And, I am by no means trying to suggest that the providers themselves are bad. The system, however, is not great. And it just is not set up in such a way that it could ever. I mean, I don't care how good the prison itself was, it'd be really hard to provide that kind of mental health support when people are also, serving time in the same place with people that, may prey upon them. I mean, there's just always going to be a difficulty with that environment and mental health providers. I'm sorry, but that is the cutest puppy. Hello.
Oh.
Hi,
Oh.
Hi, sweetheart.
How old is he or she? Is it a puppy?
Yeah, it's a boy.
Oh.
So cute.
I think we all needed that at this point.
Yeah.
It's a little bit of joy, but this has been such a great discussion. Is that Gunner? Is Gunner his name? Oh, how cute.
Hi, Gunner. Hi, Gunner. Who's a good boy? Who's a good boy? Is that Gunner? Is that Gunner? Yes, it is. Oh, you're so cute. Did you have a question, Carolyn?
No, I did not. Sorry.
Okay, that's okay. All right. Any
Well,
other? Yeah.
Yeah. Any other questions? Just want to give everyone a chance. If not, then I just want to thank you, Susan,
Thank
for
you
being
so
with
much.
me. This has just been such a great conversation, and you know, prior to our meeting today, it's something that we must, you know, continuously discuss. Almost every meeting, every class meeting, it's something that's with us all the time in terms of how we're thinking about what drives mass incarceration or over incarceration. What can we do? How can we approach it? And it's been really illuminating for me just to hear from the class in terms of the ideas of how we can do this on a you know, maybe just a more localized community basis. And you know, so I think we're all kind of thinking in that sense of what we can do, what hasn't been working, you know, what hasn't been working, and what direction we can move in. And yes, so thank you again.
Oh, thank you so much, Professor Kelly. And thank you all so much for listening to me go on and on. I really appreciate it. And I appreciate, really, I cannot tell you enough how important it is to me, how much it means to me to see all of you with this interest and to know that you're going to be going out in the world with this information. You're the beginning of the change. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Have a great evening. Bye.
You too. Bye-bye, guys.
Coming up to 6 o'clock. So do we all just want to come back at 6:14? Just have a bit of a break. I think I'm not doing my math right. Let's just say 6:15. Let's just give ourselves, it's 6 o'clock in my mind. Give ourselves a nice long break. And I'm excited to hear from our student led discussion on the topic I Did It Norway. So Hannah is going to present on that. And it's really interesting. We got to hear from Susan Champion, who got to go there. So the attorneys are still going there every year. So that's really good to know. So I'll see you all in a bit. Please have a nice stretch and get a cup of coffee or something to eat. I'll see you in a bit.